Imagine a superpower that commands half the world, fields the largest land army on Earth, puts the first human in space, and wields thousands of nuclear warheads. Now imagine that this same superpower collapses almost overnight, not because it lost a war, not because an enemy invaded, but because it spent itself out of existence. The mystery is simple to ask, but far harder to answer. Did the United States genuinely outspend the Soviet Union into collapse, or did the USSR fall for reasons much deeper than budgets and missiles? And if it really was an economic race, how did the supposedly stronger system lose? This is the story of a contest where tanks and rockets mattered far less than factories, microchips, oil prices, and the ability to adapt. It's a story about the hidden pressure points of a command economy, and how money, not missiles, became the decisive weapon of the Cold War. But the ending isn't what most people think, and the implications for today may be even more unsettling. Before the crisis, before the arms race that spiraled out of control, the Soviet Union saw itself as the future. Its industrial plans were rigid but ambitious. Its leadership believed that central planning could outperform messy capitalist markets. And for a while, especially after World War II, that looked true. The USSR rebuilt faster than many expected, established a sphere of influence stretching across Eastern Europe, and poured resources into heavy industry. It created a superpower through sheer mobilization. Meanwhile, the United States, though wealthier and more technologically dynamic, didn't yet see the Cold War as an economic duel. That idea would come later, shaped by presidents like John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, and advisors who understood that military strength could be a lever to stress test the Soviet system. But at first, the United States was mostly reacting to Soviet moves. The Berlin blockade, the first Soviet nuclear test, and later the launch of Sputnik. Each event nudged Washington toward a new idea, that Takvasham, economic pressure could be more decisive than direct confrontation. It's easy to forget that the Soviet Union initially held surprising advantages. By the late 1950s, it was producing more steel than the United States. It matched American nuclear production pace for years. It developed early breakthroughs in rocketry, space technology, and missile systems. But each of these achievements came at a cost buried deep inside the Soviet economic structure. The Soviet system forced growth by flooding resources into military and heavy industry. Consumer goods, services, and innovation outside the defense sector lagged far behind. The economy was balanced on a knife's edge, a nation acting like it was permanently at war, extracting as much capacity as possible even in peacetime. This tension didn't matter much early on, but as the Cold War escalated, it would become fatal. The origins of the spending race go back to the early 1960s. The US and USSR were both building nuclear arsenals that soon exceeded any rational military purpose. But the United States had something the Soviet Union did not: an economy capable of expanding without breaking. Every time the US upgraded missile systems or invested in new technology, the Soviet Union felt compelled to respond. And every time the Soviets responded, they diverted more and more of their limited civilian resources to military needs. By the 1970s, the pattern was unmistakable. The US could spend more, innovate faster, and recover from recessions more quickly. The USSR could not. Its military budget consumed an enormous share of national output. Estimates range from 15 to 25% of GDP, though the true number may have been even higher. And because the Soviet Union hid economic data from the world and even from many of its own officials, policymakers didn't fully understand how unsustainable the system had become. Still, the breaking point wasn't obvious. The Soviets maintained strategic parity in nuclear forces. They built a blue water navy. They expanded influence in Africa and Asia. And for a moment, détente seemed to slow the economic drain. But it wouldn't last. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the United States introduced a new strategy. Instead of matching the Soviet system for system, it aimed to monopolize ahead so dramatically that the USSR would be forced to follow at any cost. This was the beginning of the economic war behind the Cold War. American defense spending surged. Programs like the B-1 bomber, the MX missile, expanded carrier groups, rapid technological upgrades in communications and satellite systems, and later the Strategic Defense Initiative created an arms race on a technological front the Soviets were poorly equipped to compete in. The US also invested heavily in microprocessors, stealth technology, precision-guided munitions, and surveillance capabilities, areas where the Soviet Union lacked a competitive civilian tech base. At the same time, the global oil market shifted dramatically. The USSR relied on oil exports to finance much of its hard currency earnings. When oil prices dropped in the mid-1980s, Soviet revenues plunged. Suddenly, the country that had bet everything on heavy industry and resource extraction found itself unable to pay for imports, food, or new technologies. But the most important pressure wasn't oil, missiles, or geopolitics. It was internal stagnation. Soviet industry was decades behind modern standards. Agriculture underperformed so badly that the USSR, the largest country on earth, had to import grain. Innovation slowed. Bureaucracy multiplied. Citizens knew consumer goods were inferior, and shortages became more common. When Mikhail Gorbachev took office in 1985, he inherited a system burning resources faster than it could produce them. Military spending wasn't just high, it was overwhelming the entire economic structure. And while American defense spending was also significant, it rested on the back of a much larger, more dynamic and more productive economy. Gorbachev tried to fix the system without abandoning socialism. He introduced restructuring, limited openness, and selective modernization. But these reforms revealed new problems. Once the Soviet government allowed limited transparency, the true state of the economy became undeniable. The USSR wasn't keeping pace. It was falling apart. As Gorbachev pulled back from the arms race and sought negotiations with the United States, the economic contradictions worsened. Factories couldn't improve efficiency fast enough. State budgets cratered. Republics within the USSR demanded more autonomy. The old guard resisted reforms. Citizens questioned whether the system had ever worked at all. By 1991, the Soviet Union was exhausted. Not defeated militarily. Not outmaneuvered in battle. Exhausted by an economic race it could never win. But here is where most narratives stop too early. The United States did not destroy the Soviet Union alone. Rather, it accelerated structural weaknesses already present. The Soviet system was rigid. It couldn't shift from heavy industry to computers. It couldn't adjust to global markets. It couldn't reward innovation. It couldn't decentralize decision-making without tearing itself apart. The arms race exposed these weaknesses, brutally and publicly. So did the United States outspend the USSR into collapse? Indirectly, yes, but the collapse happened because the Soviet economy lacked the flexibility, adaptability, and productivity to survive a long-term technological competition. The American strategy worked because it targeted the deepest vulnerabilities of a command economy reliant on brute force production. And that leads to the part of the story most people miss, the modern parallels. Today, military spending is rising worldwide. The United States still spends more on defense than the next several nations combined. China is rapidly modernizing and expanding its technological capabilities. Russia, far less wealthy but still heavily militarized, channels substantial resources into its armed forces. Many nations allocate increasing budgets to cyber warfare, artificial intelligence, space systems, and autonomous weapons. Here is the surprising pattern. The real contest isn't numbers on a defense spreadsheet. It's whether economies can sustain technological acceleration without sacrificing internal stability. Just as in the Cold War, the greatest threat to any major power may not be an enemy army. It may be economic stagnation, technological dependency, demographic strain, or an inflexible political system unable to adapt. Consider modern data points. Half of global military spending comes from countries issuing record debt levels. Several advanced economies today devote rising shares of GDP to defense while facing slowing growth aging populations, shrinking workforces, or declining industrial capacity. Meanwhile, emerging powers face their own contradictions: rising military ambitions paired with economic constraints or technological bottlenecks. The pattern repeats. When nations pursue military or technological dominance without a stable economic base, pressure builds invisibly until it reaches a breaking point. The Cold War's lesson isn't that spending wins, it's that unsustainable spending destroys. So what does this story leave us with? First takeaway: economic adaptability is more powerful than sheer military capacity. The country that innovates fastest, not the one that stockpiles the most weapons, gains the long-term advantage. Second, transparency and flexibility matter. Systems that hide economic weaknesses or refuse to adjust will be the most vulnerable in any prolonged competition. Third, every arms race carries hidden costs. These costs rarely appear dramatic at first. They accumulate slowly, silently, until a sudden crisis makes them impossible to ignore. The warning is simple. Nations today face the same strategic temptation that doomed the Soviet Union, believing that military buildup can substitute for economic strength. The United States, China, Russia, and many others are entering an era where weapons become more complex, technology cycles move faster, and the price of staying ahead grows steeper. The Cold War showed that even a superpower can collapse when the economic foundation erodes beneath it. And that raises the open-ended question. In a world where technological arms races are accelerating, which nations are building sustainable strength and which are quietly repeating the Soviet mistake? If you want to explore more stories that uncover the hidden forces shaping history, conflict, and economics, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video. And let me know in the comments which Cold War mystery you want to see covered next.